Florentine history from the beginnings to about 1530. Hold on to your hat. We're going to go pretty quickly, hopefully intelligibly, as we take a look at the development of this important city. If you have been to Florence, you might not be able to see that Florence was, like almost all cities in Italy today, a Roman city, because none of the Roman ruins, unlike the city of Rome itself, can be seen as you walk along the streets. Nevertheless, if you've been to Florence, there is some evidence that Florence is a Roman city because it's, well, laid out like a Roman city. If you go to the area between the cathedral and the Arno River, you'll notice, for example, the streets are all straight, at least for a while, and at right angles to one another. And you will notice there's a great big rectangular piazza between the cathedral and the Arno River, today called the Piazza della Repubblica. That was, in fact, the old Roman forum of the ancient Roman town that today we call Florence. By the way, once you get outside of that old Roman town as you're walking around Florence today, that's when the streets start going at funny angles. That's when the piazzas are irregular in shape. That's when you get windy streets. That's when you can no longer go around the block. Well, exactly when in Roman times Florence was founded was an issue of great debate, not just historical, but ideological debate in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Dante had in some ways assumed that Florence was a city that came from the days of the Roman Empire because Dante admired the Roman Empire. But by the 15th century, the Florentines had discovered, or semi-discovered, documents that showed that Florence was in fact a Republican Roman foundation because, of course, back then in the 15th century, the Florentines saw themselves as a republic, and therefore it was their tradition since the beginning. There were even arguments during the Renaissance that Florence had Etruscan origins before the time of Rome. But one thing we can say for sure is that Florence wasn't a very important Roman town. It was just another Roman town. It is important to say, however, that by late antiquity, 4th and 5th centuries, Florence, like other cities in Italy, had become the seats of bishops. And that becomes important because as the Roman Empire in the West collapses and urban life somewhat disintegrates following the collapse of Roman authority, one of the raison d'etre for the existence of places like Florence was it was a religious center. It was a place where the church was administered from, for a bishop administered not just the city, but the territory around it, called a diocese. So Florence has both a Roman origin, and also it is a real and important place since early Christian times. In the early Middle Ages, like most cities in Italy, Florence was reduced in population and subject to attacks. For example, the Ostrogothic ruler Totila seems to have come in and done a great deal of damage to Florence in the 6th century. And we know relatively little about Florence, as well as, again, many other Italian cities in the early Middle Ages. But in the 11th century, the population of Europe, and Italy in particular, began to increase. And of course, there's more of an urban tradition in Italy than there was in the rest of Europe, especially when you get very far away from the Mediterranean. But it was the coastal cities of Italy, not the inland cities like Florence, that were the first really to emerge as new urban realities in the 11th and early 12th century. Pisa, Genoa, Amalfi, and so on really did take on a new and somewhat international importance before Florence did. But Florence did begin to develop its civic institutions, and it began to grow significantly in the 12th century. It became a cloth manufacturing city, something that was possible to do because of the fact the Arno River flows through Florence, providing the water that is needed for the making of fine woolen cloth. And as the city began to expand, in fact, in the 12th and 13th and early 14th century, it got 2 new sets of walls as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. So too did new civic institutions arise. First, a fairly elite group of wealthy merchants and urban people tried to wrest authority from the bishop. And there were contests between what we would call the civil government and the ecclesiastical government of Florence. That's important because we need to realize not just in Italy generally with the Pope, but in all of the city-states like Florence, there continued to be, all the way through Machiavelli's time, remember he dies in 1527, continues to be struggle between ecclesiastical and secular power, because the bishop, in a kind of power vacuum in the early Middle Ages, essentially became the governor of a city like Florence, and of course, like all governors or all institutions of government, did not want easily to yield power to some new set of authorities. In the 13th century, what we have is a broader kind of government beginning to develop in Florence, because you get a lot of what we would today call middling merchants. Not the great wool merchants, not the great international traders, but these are people who make purses or belts or things that were by and large for local consumption. This sort of middling group of folks, whom we call by the Italian word the popolo, the people. This does not mean the very lowest rungs on the social ladder in Florence, but it's sort of middle class that we call the popolo, began to demand some role in government, some role in the affairs of state in the 13th century. And this led to real clashes, because you have still the ecclesiastical institutions that are real and powerful. You have the institutions of this earlier urban elite, and now you have parallel institutions very often of the popolo. And so the 13th century and the early 14th century were a tumultuous period in Florentine history. Now, let's make that a little bit more complicated. Because in the 13th century, there was a big, sort of Europe-wide, ultimately, contest for who's the boss of Europe, to put it as simply as possible. And the contestants are the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Although the emperor didn't directly govern France or England or Spain or whatever, nevertheless, the empire was itself an important entity, made up, at least in theory, of Germany and parts of Italy. But it was also an important symbol of secular political authority. And so in this clash, which had its most intense moments in Italy between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, especially when, by the middle of the 13th century, the Holy Roman Emperor was also the king of Sicily. Sicily means the island and southern Italy. And therefore, in a sense, with him being as emperor, the ruler of northern Italy, and as king of Sicily, the ruler of southern Italy, with the Pope in between, it caused a great deal of difficulty, and there were battles and wars and even kinds of crusades that the Pope launched against the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, the reason this is important to us is because within the cities of Italy, Florence being one of them, the various factions that were developing there over local issues also took sides in this bigger struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. And the terms we use for these two major factions, many of you are familiar with. Those who supported the Pope were the Guelphs, and those who supported the Holy Roman Emperor were the Ghibellines. Now, Florence was, throughout its history, a predominantly Guelph city. That is to say, almost all the time, the Guelphs had more power and controlled the city, and the Ghibellines were a kind of political minority and often in exile. There were, however, two exceptions to that in the 13th century, when at least for small periods of time, the Ghibellines did dominate. However, after 1266, incidentally, for those of you who are Dante readers, that's the year after Dante was born. After 1266, Florence is a Guelph city again, and really always after that time. However, what happened to the Guelph party is what often happens when one side more or less totally defeats the other. That is to say, it divided into factions. And we call those, for very odd reasons, we call those the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs. The name comes from the fact that one of the women of one of the factions was named Bianca, which is simply the Italian word for white. And so one faction took up that name, and therefore the other became the opposite, the black. So that's actually where the names white and black Guelphs come from. And there was a great clash between these two factions of Guelphs right after 1300. And the white Guelphs were expelled by the black Guelphs. Most famously, what that meant that Dante Alighieri was sent into exile, an exile from which he never returned. And of course, he wrote about all of these controversies, as well as the earlier Guelph Ghibelline controversies, in his Divine Comedy, which I know many of you have read, and those who haven't, stop the tape, go out and read the Divine Comedy, and then come back and we'll do some more Machiavelli. Dante is a guy you ought to get to know. Now, we know a lot about this period because we have good chronicles, as well as Dante's Divine Comedy, to tell us about all of these struggles. And of course, Machiavelli was a great reader of Dante. He loved to read Dante. And he knew these other works as well, so that these become the sources for his history of Florence. And he, as you will see, he draws examples from throughout Florentine history in the various books that he writes. Let's now turn to the 14th century. We're creeping up now toward the century in which Machiavelli was born. There were great changes in Florence in terms of its internal politics, its foreign relations, and its culture. We're going to set the culture aside for a little bit. That's going to be the subject of the next lecture, the development of humanism. We're not going to talk much about painting per se, but I'm sure many of you know that the early 14th century is sometimes called the Age of Giotto, for example. He dies in 1337. He lives through this period of clamorous Florentine history that I've just described, the end of the Guelph Ghibelline struggle and the fight between the white and the black Guelphs. I want to focus here on politics because, of course, Machiavelli focuses on politics. Florence sought to expand its territory. After all, it's a city-state surrounded by, very often, enemy city-states. Lucca, Pisa, Siena, Arezzo, for example. There are no natural borders between them, really, as there are natural borders between Florence and what's north of it, with the Apennines sort of curling down and across the northern boundary of Florentine territory. And in fact, one of the things Florence desired for a long time was to get its own seaport. Because although the Arno ran from Florence to the sea, it didn't run through Florentine territory all that time. It emptied into the Mediterranean in Pisan territory. And in fact, in 1408, Pisa was captured by Florence, although Florence hardly held on to it all the time after that. It was always an important part of Florentine policy to hold on to Pisa. Again, one of the questions Machiavelli will raise in The Prince and the Discourses is, how do you hold Pisa? And has Florence done it very well? That is indeed a good question. In addition to being a big cloth manufacturing city, more and more Florence became a city of worldwide bankers, replacing its neighbor to the south, Siena, as a principal banker of Western Europe in general. And so Florence becomes a center, therefore, not just of manufacturing, but also an economic center of Europe because of the fact that great banking families arose there. Now, in the 14th century, the most important families were the Bardi and the Peruzzi families. They're going to collapse near the middle of the 14th century. And in the 15th century, of course, the biggest of all the Florentine banks will belong to the Medici family. But there was enough political and economic and social strife that in 1342, Florence did what many other cities around it had done, called in a strong man and said, okay, take over this mess and rule it. They called in a Frenchman, Walter of Brienne, whom we usually know as the Duke of Athens. Don't think of him as a Greek. That's simply his title. It's Frenchman. As soon as the Duke of Athens sort of took residence in Florence, the Florentines said, oops, we have made a mistake. This is not a good idea. They drove out the Duke of Athens within a year, And they always prided themselves. This is one of those historical moments where the Florentines said, you know, ultimately we would not give up our liberty. We recognize that liberty is the essential of the Florentine people. And again, wrong guy. Machiavelli will look back to this period and see how the Florentines responded in times of strife. Many other cities called in strong men who essentially never left. And this happened in places like Milan and other cities as well. In the middle of the 14th century came the most important demographic event of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that is to say, the arrival of the Black Death. There are scholars today who doubt whether it is all or even part bubonic plague, as we have come to be told, but nevertheless, this tremendous demographic disaster happened. Here are the numbers, because we need to remember that the Black Death didn't just come once. The diseases continued to appear really into the 17th century. And we think that the numbers are something like this. There might have been 130,000 people living inside the walls of Florence before the Black Death, in, let's say, 1347. By 1427, okay, we're talking about 30,000 people, or at least fewer than 40,000, living inside the walls. Think about that. Not all at once, but over the course of several outbreaks of disease, Florence lost 2/3 or more of its population. A town to the south, San Gimignano, over that same period of time, lost perhaps 80% of its population. So we need to appreciate the fact that, as you can imagine, the decades following the arrival of the Black Death brought about a great deal of social and political turmoil. In fact, in 1378, there was a kind of rebellion in Florence by those who were essentially unempowered politically, those who were wool workers, but who did not belong to a guild, because guild membership was a prerequisite for direct political participation. And for 3 years, there was some violence, there were some murders, there was a real attempt by these wool workers to get control of Florence. Ultimately, they failed. And by 1381, things seem to have been back to normal as much as that was possible. And in fact, a new constitution, we would say, was established that was even more restrictive in terms of who were the active political players than the constitution that existed before this wool workers' rebellion, which we know by its Italian name, the Ciompi Rebellion. Well, in the period from 1381 to 1434, therefore, there was a kind of republican normalcy with a fairly restricted group of participants. One of the families that we begin to take note of, in fact, it even had some sympathies with the lower classes during the rebellion of the Ciompi, is the Medici family. They've been around a long time, but they had not been the major players. However, in the early 14th century, there emerges the figure of Cosimo de' Medici. And although Cosimo was briefly exiled in 1433, he came back in 1434, and that's the date we usually give for the beginning of Medici domination of Florence. When we think of the age of the Medici, that starts with the return from exile of Cosimo de' Medici in 1434. He was the ruler of Florence for the next 30 years, dying in 1464, and in fact being known later on, it says so on his tombstone, as the father of his country, the Pater Patriae. Now, one of the questions that scholars have always been interested in, one of the questions that Machiavelli was interested in, is how did Cosimo govern? What principles of governance did he use? Well, it's interesting. Cosimo held no office. He was, as he would sometimes sort of say, I'm just one of the boys. I'm a citizen of Florence like the rest of you. Now, of course, he's the head of the Medici Bank, which is the biggest of all the Florentine banks by this time. So he's the richest guy around. He uses a lot of that money for the grandeur of the Republic. Building buildings, commissioning paintings. For example, if you go into museums, you will discover, if you look at paintings that were commissioned in Florence by some of the greatest artists during the life of Cosimo de' Medici, you'll find that two of the most common saints you will find in these paintings are Saints Cosmas and Damian, two medical saints. Now, of course, that's nice because this is still the age of this great disease where you might want doctor saints, as Cosmas and Damian were. But let's remember, Cosimo de' Medici is, of course, named for St. Cosmas, and therefore it was a way of glorifying himself. Don't be surprised in the next generation of Medici to find a lot of St. Lawrences, because, of course, it was Lorenzo de' Medici, which is simply the Italian for Lawrence, who, after all, was the Medici ruler for many years toward the end of the 15th century. But the main way that Cosimo held power was he controlled what names went into the bags from which public officials were drawn. In other words, a lot of offices were decided by lottery, and therefore the way to control power was to make sure that only people who were favorable to you had their names in the bags. By being able to control what were called the scrutinies, the development of which names are in the bag, Cosimo held great power. It's probably fair to say that although Florence was a republic in name during the time of Cosimo de' Medici, and following his death for that matter, it was more and more, in fact, ruled by the strongest man, and of course the strongest man was a member of the Medici family. When Cosimo died in 1464, he was succeeded by his son, Piero. Piero sort of gets a bad reputation among historians. His 5-year rule wasn't very effective. And there was clearly some disaffection with the Medici that sort of was a little bit louder and more dramatic during the rule of Piero. But Piero was ill the entire time, and it may be less his ability than his health that is responsible for the fact that his 5-year rule in Florence, again, rule is in quotation marks because he didn't hold any formal office. But in 1469, when Piero died, he was succeeded by his young son, Lorenzo, whom many people today still refer to as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he ruled in Florence until his death in 1492. The very year that Lorenzo de' Medici became the leader of Florence, a little baby across the Arno from the Medici palace named Niccolò Machiavelli was born. So he is raised during the period where, again, in form, Florence is a republic. But in fact, it is in the hands primarily of its first citizen, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Now, despite the fact that we associate Lorenzo with great gentle rule, beautiful art, his own poetry, the founding of educational institutions, and all the rest of it, it is important to remember there was a good deal of disagreement. And there was, in fact, and we're going to see that Machiavelli is very interested in this, an important conspiracy against the Medici in 1478 that was aimed at executing, murdering, assassinating Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. Giuliano, in fact, did die in the so-called Pazzi conspiracy, but Lorenzo was able to escape. This will be Machiavelli's big story when discussing conspiracies and how they work. We need to remember that Machiavelli was 9 years old when the Pazzi conspiracy occurred. And once Lorenzo was safe, there was extraordinary public recrimination against those who carried out the Pazzi conspiracy, including people dragged through the streets, including people who were hanged out of windows, including the window of the city hall, the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And we have to wonder, first of all, whether Niccolò Machiavelli actually saw this, but even if he didn't, certainly that was the story that he would have heard, not just that week or that month at the dinner table. But the Pazzi conspiracy would have been one of those stories that would have been told over and over and over again and drilled into him. And Machiavelli's curiosity led him to think and write a good deal about the Pazzi conspiracy later on. Lorenzo died in 1492, was succeeded by a not very talented son named Piero. And in 1494, the French invaded Italy. This is one of those draw the line dates, because after 1494, although this is something of an oversimplification, Italy becomes the battlefield for almost all of Europe. You name a country on the continent, and I'll bet you they had soldiers or their king invaded Italy in the next couple decades. The Spanish, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's German, the French. There are a lot of Swiss soldiers who were there as mercenaries, hence the papacy had them, hence the Swiss guards that you see in the Vatican today. And so the invasion of the French is one of those lines that's drawn in Italian history, in Renaissance history. Piero de' Medici didn't handle the situation very well and was forced into exile from Florence. In 1494, the 60-year rule of the Medici comes to an end, and Florence once again establishes a republic, a real republic, with a constitution that was haggled over, partly modeled on the Venetian model, since it was a republic, and Florence goes into another period of proud Republican history, republic in fact, and not just in name. One of the great supporters of that republic was a dynamic Dominican preacher, not a native Florentine, from in fact a monastery that had been built in Florence by the Medici. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. No doubt the 25-year-old Machiavelli, that's how old he was when Piero de' Medici went into exile, heard those sermons and respected Savonarola, although certainly had none of Savonarola's religious convictions. In fact, in The Prince, he hangs the great tag on Savonarola. He calls him an unarmed prophet. In 1498, Savonarola was burned in the center of Florence, and a few days later, coincidentally, I might add, Machiavelli got his first official job in the Florentine Republic. He was named a secretary of one of the agencies of the government. Now, he therefore entered into the active life of the governance of the Republic under a guy named Piero Soderini. We're going to hear of him again because he was the de facto and in fact later on elected the leader for life of this Florentine Republic. Machiavelli worked with him, Machiavelli knew him, Machiavelli respected him, but Machiavelli thinks he really messed up in 1512 by being too shy and not being bold enough when changes were afoot. Because in 1512, the Republic collapsed and the Medici returned to power. That meant that Machiavelli was out of a job, and pretty soon he found it, if not necessary, at least advisable to move to the family estate about 12 kilometers south of Florence in a little village up in the hills towards San Casciano. There he wrote The Prince and the Discourses. And although he came into Florence often and ultimately did get some work as historian from the Medici in the early 1520s, essentially Machiavelli's political career came to an end with the end of the Republic in 1512. Here's a guy that believes he knows a lot of stuff, who's eager to serve, who thinks he's got the right prescriptions for Florence, and he doesn't have a job in the government once the Medici take over in 1512. He never has an important post for the rest of his life. In 1527, the Medici are expelled again, and a republic is established. And Machiavelli thinks, boy, I'm going to get myself a job, maybe even my old job back, in this new republic. But he was passed over. Ironically, perhaps, because he was seen as being a little bit too comfy with the Medici, since he had worked for them in the last years of Medici rule. And a very disenchanted Machiavelli died in June of 1527. By the way, to tell you the rest of the story, in 1530, the Medici return, and they never leave, eventually becoming the Grand Dukes of Tuscany and remaining the rulers of the Florentine state until they died out in the 18th century. So there we have it, 1,500 years of Florentine history, and we'll use that as the political and narrative backdrop for the life and writings of Niccolò Machiavelli.